Welcome to the All for Literacy podcast, hosted by Dr. Liz Brooke, welcoming established and emerging voices in literacy education and the science of reading. Explore with us the connections between literacy research, educators' knowledge and skills, and the implementation into classroom instruction.
I think we need to realize that we can start building knowledge while kids are acquiring those foundational skills, but it needs to be done in a different way.
You just heard Natalie Wexler, author of The Knowledge Gap. Today, Natalie joins Dr. Liz Brooke in a conversation about the role of content knowledge in literacy education, assessments, and educational equity. Here's your host, Dr. Liz Brooke.
Thank you for joining us today on All for Literacy podcast. We come together to connect new and established research with the educators applying those ideas daily in our schools. And as we work to improve access to effective literacy instruction, it's essential that the information and conversation flows both ways, from research to the classroom and from classroom experience back to the researchers. Today, I am joined by Natalie Wexler, an education writer and author of The Knowledge Gap, The Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It. Welcome, Natalie, and thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
Thanks, Liz. I'm glad to be here.
I am very excited as a speech-language pathologist and former first grade teacher. This topic is near and dear to my heart, so I'm really excited to dive into this with you. And I always like to start these conversations by asking, what brought you to education? What sparked your interest in education, given, I think, a background first in law? Is that correct?
Yeah, among other things, law and journalism and history, mostly,
Okay.
which kind of all comes together, in some ways. Maybe the law thing, not so much, but I guess it was about 12, 13 years ago now. So I live in Washington, D.C., and there was a lot of education reform activity here. And, I thought it was really important and interesting. And I basically was interested in this, what has sometimes been called the achievement gap, the gap in test scores between kids at the upper and lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. And I wanted to figure out why it was so large and why we'd been making so little progress in narrowing it. And as I kind of got interested in the education reform movement, I saw there was a lot of education activity in DC that, was really not being covered. And so I started writing about education for a local news website. And I learned a lot through writing about it. I mean, that is one way to really learn stuff. And, talking to teachers, it's going into schools. And then I eventually stumbled across an issue that affected not just Washington, D.C., but really at least the whole country and some others. And so that seemed like something that someone should write a book about. So that's kind of what led me to do it.
Okay, well, and that leads me to my next question. So how did that inspire The Knowledge Gap? What was it that you found, not just in Washington, D.C., but maybe around the country? What drove you to write The Knowledge Gap?
Yeah, so education reformers had been talking about high school as the problem and still often do. And so that's where I started looking. But what was eventually explained to me, I can't say I figured this out, was that the problems that become so apparent at higher grade levels really have their roots in the way we go about elementary school instruction. And specifically, we spend a lot of time on reading. Reading and math take up almost, I'd say 90% of the instructional time in schools. And a lot of the time on reading is spent on reading comprehension skills and strategies, things like finding the main idea or making inferences about a word in a text, and the kinds of things that appear to be measured by standardized reading comprehension tests. And these skills and strategies are taught, as generally applicable skills. So you have kids, you might demonstrate a skill like comparing and contrasting. The teacher might model that for 10 minutes on a book chosen for its, not for its topic, but for how well it lends itself to demonstrating comparing and contrasting. And then kids go off to practice the skill on books on random topics that have been determined to be at their individual reading levels. And again, the idea is not for kids to acquire any substantive knowledge. The books are not categorized by topic, but by things like sentence length or how frequently used the words are. And so the theory behind this, and this goes on for years, sometimes through middle school, and really to the marginalization or almost sometimes elimination of things like social studies and science. And so the theory is that if kids master a skill like finding the main idea by practicing it diligently, they will be able to apply that skill to find the main idea, gain knowledge from any text that they try to read. But what I discovered was that cognitive scientists have known for a long time that's really not how reading comprehension works. What's more important than sort of general skill, which really doesn't exist when you're talking about something like finding the main idea, what's more important is how much relevant knowledge you have to what you are reading about. And that could be knowledge of the topic, or, eventually, after you've learned a lot about a lot of topics, you get a sort of critical mass of general academic knowledge and vocabulary and familiarity with the complex sentence structure of written language. And that's what enables you to read and understand texts on topics you don't already know about. So, but what we're doing is basically denying kids access to that kind of knowledge often until they get to high school. And then there's a huge gap in what they know about the world, not because they couldn't have learned those things, but because we haven't taught them those things. And where that gap in test scores comes in is that kids from more highly educated families who tend to have more resources in our society are in a better position to pick up that kind of academic knowledge and vocabulary outside school, at home. Right. And so that gives them an advantage on those standardized tests and in school and in life.
Absolutely. So you shared so much wonderful information there. Let's unpack some of that. So you were talking about, this drive to write the book around the lack of instruction or exposure to background knowledge and teaching it in a way that is comprehensive and not isolating skills and things like that. Excuse me. And you started to talk about there at the end, right? Like the achievement gap, we also now, I know I think of it myself as the opportunity gap. And you started to address this a little bit at the end, that families students from families, higher income families, have that opportunity to get some of that knowledge that wasn't being taught explicitly in schools, or in a systematic way. So I think the thing that it most resonated with me and helped me understand this in a really explicit way is the baseball study and the birds and the wugs. So can you explain that to our listeners? Because to me, the why is so critical as a teacher. For me, once I understood the why, I was trained in whole language, but once I understood the why of reading and the why of language, it just shifted everything for me.
Yeah, and I should say these are two studies. We have lots and lots of evidence out there that having background knowledge really helps with comprehension. But I do think these two studies help bring that point home very powerfully. So the baseball study was done in the late 1980s, so it's been around for a long time. A couple of researchers asked the question, what is more important in comprehension, reading comprehension? Is it general skill like finding the main idea, or is it how much you know about the topic you're reading about? And they chose the topic of baseball because they were doing this with 7th and 8th graders, and they figured there are a lot of kids out there who are not generally good readers, but they do know a lot about baseball. And so they divided these kids into 4 groups, essentially, depending on how well they had scored on a standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave them all a passage to read describing half an inning of a baseball game, and then tested their comprehension of that passage. And what they found was what really made the difference was how much a kid knew about baseball. So the kids who were poor readers, according to the standardized test, but knew a whole lot about baseball, did much, much better than the kids who were the good readers, according to the test, but did not know much about baseball. So that indicates that these skills like finding the main idea, making inferences, they are not skills like riding a bike or like decoding words, because they don't just get better with practice and then it doesn't matter what bike you're riding or whatever. It really, whether you can apply a skill like finding the main idea is going to depend a lot on your background knowledge. And then the WUG study, which was done later by Susan Newman and colleagues, I think is really interesting because it sheds light on this difference in socioeconomic circumstances.
The equity issue,
and it's not really a specialized knowledge. Baseball has its own lingo, but in this WUG study, this was done with preschoolers and from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds. And the kids were initially tested to see how much they knew about this topic of birds. And then they were read a story about birds and then test their comprehension of that story, their ability to make inferences, that sort of thing was tested. And the kids who knew more about birds, who were the kids who came from higher socioeconomic backgrounds and had more exposure to that kind of knowledge, they did better on a test of their comprehension of the bird story. Then there's another part of this experiment where they read kids basically the same story, but this time it was about animals called WUGs, who are made-up animals. And so they equalized the kids' background knowledge. None of them knew anything about WUGs because, WUGs don't exist. And this time, after they read the story about WUGs and tested the kids' comprehension, there was no significant difference in comprehension between the kids from higher and lower income families. So I do think that is a really interesting and illuminating study that shows us, what really I think it shows us is not just that, hey, well, some kids are going to know more and that's not much you can do about it. Actually, there is something we can do about it because schools can help, maybe not completely level the playing field, but certainly do a lot more than they're doing now by giving kids who are not picking up that kind of academic knowledge at home, giving it to them in school, which I think a lot of parents probably assume schools are already doing, and a lot of members of the general public. But they're not often doing that until higher grade levels, right. And we need to start early.
Yeah, so it is a really clear way, again, I think, by leveling that playing field, so to speak, by talking about something that is made up, right? Like WUGs. And you talked about in schools, you mentioned it, and I want to highlight it for our listeners, that different than decoding, right? Decoding in terms of the explicitness, the practice, the repetition. And so it's a really interesting time right now to be talking, I think, about the knowledge gap as well as the science of reading and this movement where a lot of folks incorrectly are thinking science of reading is just more phonics, right? That's all we have evidence on. And we both know that is not true. We need to think about this in a more broad spectrum. Word recognition, the language skills, and again, as a speech path, I'm always focusing on that language. And then this idea of reading comprehension being the product of these, right? But when you talked about building skills in a systematic way versus doing more heterogeneous grouping, whole grouping, right? Does it have to be, should it be one or the other? Or does it really depend on what types of skills we're talking about in terms of word recognition or syntax or building knowledge? Can you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these two aspects of reading really need to be approached in very different ways. But they shouldn't necessarily be done at different, grade levels. I think we need to realize that we can start building knowledge while kids are acquiring those foundational skills, but it needs to be done in a different way, not as a matter of practicing skills. So yes, with foundational skills, phonemic awareness, phonics, it does make sense to have kids practice those skills to automaticity, not just mastery, because then that is going to free up cognitive capacity for comprehension when they're reading, if they don't have to struggle with the decoding. But the knowledge side, I think what's really crucial, and I think what often gets left out of the discussion, is we can't rely on kids to build knowledge themselves through their own reading when they are still learning to decode and really beyond. I mean, it has been found that listening comprehension exceeds reading comprehension on average through about age 13. That's, again, a finding from back in the 80s. So what that means is that not just when they're still learning to decode, but even for a while afterwards, kids can take in more complex information and vocabulary through listening than through their own reading. And that's why reading aloud from complex text and having discussions, whole class discussions ideally, of those texts is really crucial, so that kids are not limited by their own decoding ability in terms of what knowledge they can acquire. And so through that listening and discussion, what you're doing is you're building kids' vocabulary, their knowledge, their familiarity with complex syntax in ways that will serve them well in years to come. So you're not just trying to build the vocabulary they need to understand what they themselves can read now, or even next year or the year after. You really should be using that read aloud and discussion time to introduce kids to complex vocabulary like, plummeted or foresight or, words that they're not going to find on a third or fourth grade state reading test, but they will be expected to know those words in years to come. And I have seen first graders, second graders, kids from non-English speaking families, kids from low income families, using those words. They're very happy to know that. They're very proud of being able to know those words. It's not just presenting words, because teaching vocabulary in the abstract does not work for a variety of reasons. But if they encounter these words, ideally repeatedly in an engaging context, and then they use them in class discussion so that helps transfer that information to long-term memory, those words will be there to serve them well, down the road when they need them.
Absolutely. And so that idea of listening comprehension, again, that idea of oral language is the foundation of later written language, and being able to not just limit the students to what their instructional level or their independent level, right, as people often talk about with books, which is important to consider if you're asking the students to read a book, but that is not both sides, right, of the rope or both sides of the equation. And I think, to your point, that we have to consider how we're teaching these skills, and the simple view of reading, or Scarborough's rope, I think may have misled folks a little bit, that they are equal parts or should be taught in an equal fashion. So when you think about, since your book has come out, and even before the book came out, but certainly since the book has come out, do you think more curriculums are available that are approaching instruction the way you're discussing?
Absolutely. A lot has changed. The book came out 4.5 years ago, and a lot has changed since then. And yes, there are now a number of curricula that do focus on content, put content in the foreground rather than skills. And a couple of points I want to make. That it's not that you have to choose between teaching or fostering skills and building knowledge. Right. It's a question of what you put in the foreground. So all of these curricula will bring in skills and strategies as appropriate to help kids understand and think about whatever the topic or the text is. So they are also, getting kids to compare and contrast. They're also giving them the knowledge that they need to engage in that. So, for example, a classroom I followed through a school year for the book was using a knowledge building curriculum that had kids learn in first grade about ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, and then in second grade they'd learned about ancient India and ancient China, and they had gotten to ancient Greece, and the teacher asked a question one day, what is unique about ancient Greek civilization, compared to the other ones you've learned about? And all these hands went up, and these second graders, all of whom came from low-income families. She called on one little boy who I think came from a Spanish-speaking family, and he said, well, one way that ancient Greek civilization was unique was that they didn't have fertile land to farm, so they couldn't grow crops. He could not have answered that question. He could not have engaged in comparing and contrasting unless he had acquired that knowledge of ancient civilizations through the curriculum. So yes, you want to activate prior knowledge, but you've got to make sure they have the relevant prior knowledge to be activated. And I would say, so these curricula, they all cover different bodies of knowledge in different ways, though there are choices. But they all have a few things in common that are crucial. And one is that they are organized by topic rather than by skill of the week. Mm-hmm. And they'll spend maybe 2-3 weeks or more on a topic so that kids get the repeated exposure they need to that vocabulary, those concepts, for those things to stick. And secondly, they do give all students access in some way to this complex grade level or above text, often through read-alouds and discussions, so that they're not limited to what they can decode. And then lastly, they connect the listening and the speaking part of the curriculum with the reading and writing part of the curriculum, so that rather than reading leveled texts on random topics that they may or may not know anything about, kids are reading about the same topics they've been listening to and speaking about. And if you remember the baseball study, once kids have background knowledge of a topic, they are likely to be able to read about it at a higher level, because they're not having to juggle new information in working memory along with cognitive load, along with the cognitively demanding tasks of reading and then writing again should be connected to the topics of the curriculum. Although I could also talk more about writing. That you often need more explicit writing instruction than what we've been giving, but at least if you connect it to what kids have been learning about, they have something to write about, that they want to express stuff that they know. So right. Yes, it's a terrific development that we do now have a variety of knowledge building curricula out there. And I would, if I could if people are interested in learning more about those curricula, I would suggest going to the website of the Knowledge Matters campaign, knowledgematterscampaign.org, that has a list of some good curricula and a description of what makes a curriculum a good knowledge building curriculum.
Absolutely. And we'll note that website. Sorry. Absolutely. And we will mention that in our show notes so folks can find that. And I do want to come back to writing, but before we do that, I know you also have, since the book came out, like you said, I believe 2019, you also now have a podcast, your own podcast, a 6-part series, which again, we will link in the show notes, called The Knowledge Matters. I've been listening to it myself. And so just for our listeners' sake, is that something that is kind of a follow-up to the book, or is that something where they could start with the podcast and then read the book? How would you explain the podcast to our listeners?
Yeah, the podcast is obviously somewhat related to the book. It's actually the first season of the Knowledge Matters podcast, and it's called Reading Comprehension Revisited. But you can certainly access that podcast, understand that podcast without having read the book. And on the flip side, if you have read the book, you'll find some new stuff in the podcast.
Great.
So it kind of lives alongside the book. And I think it's, maybe a more accessible entry point for some people who don't have the time to read a book, or, want to sort of dip their toe in before committing to reading a book or whatever. And I also, I was a little nervous about trying to do it. I'd never done a podcast before, and it's different from writing a book. I mean, you can't just sort of put a quote in like where you want it, and you've got people talking, and you kind of have to work around their ums and ers and all of that. But the benefit is that to hear people, and these are basically, it's a narrative. I provide the narration, but I weave in excerpts from interviews I did with practicing classroom teachers, with district leaders, with a cognitive reading scientist, And to hear people talk about their own experiences in their own voices, I think is really quite powerful. And I was lucky enough to interview some people who were quite eloquent about their experience. And I think it makes for pretty, if I say so myself, pretty powerful listening.
Yes, no, it does. And I think it was episode 2 when you spoke to Dr. Hugh Katz out of Florida State. And I have to give FSU a shout out because that's where I got my doctorate when I was working at the Florida Center for Reading Research. And also shout out to Dr. Katz as a fellow speech pathologist and researcher I've admired for a long time. But he talks about a study he did with the RFU, or Reading for Understanding grant, and the challenges of reading comprehension tests that I think is really powerful, because as you're talking about this and you mentioned how do they assess this knowledge, quote unquote, this knowledge, and making inferences and the skills. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yes, I think this is really important. We've put so much emphasis on reading comprehension, standardized reading comprehension tests as measures of almost all educational progress, and they're really very flawed instruments. And so Hugh, who I think the world of, he's terrific, and I think he's like the scientist version of me, kind of. I mean, I read what he's written, and I think, gee, I wish I'd written that. Anyway, he was involved in this big federally funded project of Reading for Understanding you mentioned, and he and his team were teaching kids, all sorts of things for a year. Grammar, but also content. And at the end of the year, they discovered, as I think other researchers have, that, the kids actually learned what they taught them, but it didn't show up on a standardized reading test. And so why would that be? Well, and we have some interesting studies that have been done recently that shed light on this. So standardized reading tests are not connected to, and this goes for tests for reading level as well. They are not connected to anything kids have actually learned. Their topics are random. And the idea is, well, we're not testing their content knowledge. We're testing their general reading comprehension ability. But of course, if you don't have enough relevant background knowledge to understand the passage, at least at a superficial level, you're not going to get a chance to demonstrate your skill at making an inference or whatever. And so I think, I thought what was one of the interesting things that you said was, like, he wasn't all that surprised when he saw these results, really no effect on standardized measures, because when he was a graduate student, there had been a lot of interest in the role of knowledge and comprehension. And as he says in the podcast, we kind of forgot about that. And researchers went off on these skills and studying, essentially looking at the kinds of things that skilled, proficient readers do if they are having trouble understanding a text, and trying to teach those things to in expert readers to kids, and turning them in by virtue of that into expert readers. Well, unfortunately, it's not that simple. And so I was really interested in, sort of reading researchers having to some extent forgotten this role of knowledge. And I don't really have a good explanation for that, except that, and I think this is true for classroom teachers, for educators as well, it's very appealing to think that, well, we don't have to go through all the hard work of figuring out what topics to teach, and then, ensuring the teacher has enough topic knowledge herself, and then, trying to build this knowledge. We can just hand kids this sort of key to all knowledge that they can use to unlock the world of books. And it does sound appealing, but unfortunately, there is no such key. Right. So I think, Hugh Katz really does a great job from the perspective of a researcher of explaining this and pointing out that these tests really disagree with each other a lot of the time. And it's not just differences in background knowledge. I mean, if a kid happens to have knowledge of the text on one test, is going to do better than if he gets a passage on another test that he doesn't know anything about. That's obvious. But also that any test, is just a moment in time. Kids could be not doing so well that day. They could be distracted, whatever. And that you can't really use these tests as such reliable measures of whether kids are actually learning.
Right. No, it's a really interesting, to your point about how researchers kind of went off in a different direction, and it was not surprising. And so I guess as we think about that, then the teachers in the classroom when you think about standardized testing being those more distal measures, right, the further away from what you're actually teaching, how can teachers better assess if they are building that knowledge and filling that gap, so to speak?
Well, to some extent, it's common sense. If you've taught kids about, say, sea mammals, ask them questions about sea mammals rather than some, maybe tangentially related or completely unrelated topic to see, because they're just not going to be able to apply the whatever skill you might think they've learned to another topic they know nothing about. And also, I think, so you can ask them questions, you could give them quizzes. We've really gotten away from this, but cognitive scientists know about something called, well, it used to be called the testing effect. They've started calling it retrieval practice because people have such bad associations with testing, but actually tests are not just a way of, evaluating a student. They are also a very powerful learning strategy. When you try to retrieve information that you have stored in long-term memory, but you may have slightly forgotten, that's a very powerful way of ensuring that in the future, when you need it, you will be able to retrieve it. So the more you practice retrieving an item of information, the more likely you are to be able to retrieve it when you need it. And this is not the be-all and end-all of education, but it is the foundation of education, is having information stored in long-term memory, because that opens up more capacity in working memory, which is the part of our consciousness where we are taking in new information and trying to make sense of it. It opens up more capacity there for taking in new information, for learning. Another way of assessing whether kids are learning, though, that I think is often overlooked, is having them write about it. And writing can be a very effective form of retrieval practice and all of those things. But also the process of writing, if it is taught in a way that doesn't overwhelm students with its difficulty, is an incredibly powerful way to develop analytical abilities, to familiarize kids with the complex syntax of written language, and to reinforce knowledge generally. And not to mention, you can teach them how to write well too. So.
Right. Well, because I believe you have another book called The Writing Revolution, a guide to advancing thinking through writing in all subjects and grades. And I believe that one came out, the first edition, before the Knowledge Gap. And I think there's a new edition coming this summer. Is that true?
Yes, fingers crossed. I mean, we're in the final throes of, making sure the format is all correct and everything. But so I should mention, I'm the co-author of that book, The Writing Revolution, and it describes a method that is not my method, a method of writing instruction that was created by my co-author, Dr. Judith Hochman, who is a veteran educator and created that over many years of trial and error, which is in some ways still ongoing, hence the second edition, which is not dramatically different from the first edition, but I think will be more user-friendly and has reorganized some of the strategies that are taught to make it work a little bit better. But yes, so Judy Hochman, I met her before I had any idea I might write the Knowledge Gap book, and I had been working actually, or trying to tutor some high school students at a high poverty high school in writing, and thinking, where, this is beyond me, because they really didn't understand like the concept of a sentence. But I also saw that they weren't, for some reason I didn't understand, I would give them something to read so that they could write in response to it, and they weren't understanding what I was asking them to read because they didn't know what like the Supreme Court was. Which we were, at the time in Washington, D.C., we were 17 blocks from the Supreme Court, but they didn't, and it was clear that they could have learned this stuff, but I just didn't understand it. And the teachers I was working with didn't understand, like, why hadn't they learned this stuff? And I came across Judy Hochman's method, which was that time called the Hochman method. And I thought, wow, this is what these kids need, because it teaches writing skills, but it also teaches them content at the same time. And so long story short, I ended up getting to know Judy, and I asked her I was on the board of a charter school in Washington, D.C. at the time, and I asked her if she could maybe see if this charter school would adopt her method of writing instruction. And she came back to me and said, well, the problem is this method of writing instruction only works if it's embedded in content, and your school isn't really teaching any content. And I remember I said, what do you mean? It's a school. Like, what are they doing?
What are they
and
teaching?
I was on the school performance committee. I thought I knew a lot about what they were teaching, but so she started explaining to me this whole problem of the focus on skills and strategies. So, and as I have come to understand the writing revolution method more deeply, and through this writing the second edition and everything, and also learning more about cognitive science, I have become more convinced than ever that if you've got a content-rich curriculum, they're not all really fully aligned with the principles of cognitive science, but they have content. And if you adapt this method of writing instruction to whatever you're teaching, it's not a curriculum, it's not a writing curriculum, it's designed to be adapted to a content-rich curriculum. If you marry these two things, the writing method and the curriculum, you will, I think, supercharge that curriculum, because this writing method of writing instruction really carries all the benefits of these principles of explicit instruction and retrieval practice and all of those things that cognitive scientists have found most kids really need in order to reach their full potential.
Absolutely. So talking about that knowledge gap in this writing method and overlapping and influencing each other, because as you were talking about the writing of something, it brings it to this whole other level, right? Like the assessment that you can get from somebody's writing, somebody's spelling, having them connect back, retrieve all the knowledge that they've been using. But you also mentioned something that I want to make sure to highlight. And again, this is something I keep coming back to. You mentioned about the sentence. They didn't understand the structure of a sentence. And when people talk about comprehension, not only do they often focus on the skills, but I think very often people jump to a complex text or a paragraph even. And a lot of research, especially in the upper grades, has talked about the influence of syntactic knowledge on overall comprehension. And even with writing, understanding and explicitly talking about what is a sentence, because even a single word, a 3-letter word like and or but, dramatically changes the meaning of the sentence. But understanding how to include that in your writing as you're reading, as you're listening, right? You started at the beginning talking about exposing students not only to rich vocabulary, but rich syntax in those complex sentences. And I feel like, and research has shown that writing is that kind of culmination in bringing it back together, and the listening comprehension or the receptive part of the task in the written expression, right? The difficulty grows. But if you're connecting those and weaving those together, how powerful that can be.
Yes. And I think this is really overlooked to some extent in the research, but also certainly in the way we've been going about trying to teach reading comprehension. If we limit kids to texts that essentially they can understand themselves, sort of at their independent reading level, those texts, presumably, I mean, they may be about topics kids don't know anything about, but theoretically, they've got the kind of vocabulary and syntax that kids are already familiar with. That makes it understandable to them. So how are they ever going to get exposure to the things that are going to enable them to move up to more complex text, more academic knowledge and vocabulary, and familiarity with that complex syntax? And so I think reading aloud can help introduce kids to that, both of those things, including complex syntax. But even more powerful is to teach kids explicitly how to use that kind of syntax in their own writing. If you can use a subordinating conjunction or an appositive or whatever, right, you're much more likely to understand that when you encounter it in your reading. And I think we have to be aware that kids can be good decoders, great conversationalists, maybe even have a good vocabulary, but if they are not familiar with that complex syntax of written language, it can really be a significant barrier to comprehension. And this is quite widespread. So I came across this long-term, large-scale study finding that fewer than 10% of 8th graders can evaluate complex syntax. And there was an article in the New Yorker about the end of the English major and how kids, are not majoring in English anymore. But one thing, little factoid in this article really struck me, which is that a Harvard English professor was talking about how when she teaches a novel like The Scarlet Letter, a 19th century novel, her Harvard students can't understand the sentences, like they don't know where the subject is and what the verb is. So, I mean, we're not all going to be reading The Scarlet Letter, although, we used to in high school, but I don't know how many high school students are reading that anymore. But it's not just 19th century novels. I mean, newspapers, magazines, job instruction manuals, they all use more complex syntax. Children's books use more complex syntax than we do in normal conversation. So
Absolutely.
If it's almost, and this is one of Judy Hochman's insights, written language really is in many ways a second language, even for native English speakers, and needs to be taught explicitly.
Absolutely.
Through writing, ideally.
Yes. And again, the skills and the knowledge connected with oral language, and then, like you said, with written language differ in that explicit teaching of syntax and those complex text sentence structures, I think is so critical and missing in a lot of places. So this has been such a great conversation, and although there's still some challenges or opportunities for growth in the classrooms, there's also tremendous forward momentum. So when you think about where we are in the country, whether it is more curriculums actually available that focus on the content-rich discussions and building that knowledge, or more emphasis on explicit instruction in phonics and syntax, what makes you most hopeful for the future of literacy?
Well, I mean, I have a partial view of what's going on in the country because I get invited to speak at places that are interested in using this kind of curriculum and enthusiastic about it. And some of them have been using it. And so I get to hear story after story from teacher after teacher about the, things that they're seeing in their classrooms. And what I hear over and over again is, I never thought my kids could do these things. These kids are doing things far beyond what I expected. So I think we have been underestimating what young children and sometimes older children can do if you give them the raw material and the guidance and practice they need to reach their full potential. So it's very encouraging. I mean, there's certain parts of the country that are doing this more than others, but it's spreading. It used to be, first it was Louisiana, then it was Tennessee, and then I seem to be going to Texas every week, and now it's like Indiana and Ohio, but also the Northeast. And I think it's not totally organic because some of this is coming from above, and lists of curricula that districts and schools are encouraged or even maybe required sometimes to adopt or to choose from. But I do think it's also growing organically as word spreads. Hey, the school in the next district, I know somebody there, and interesting things are happening. I think we need more of that. I think we need to have an easier way of identifying what curricula are schools using. It's very hard to figure this out. It's not readily available. And so how can you know what's working if you don't know what curriculum a school is using? But if we could get that information out there, and then it would be easier for educators who are curious about this to find perhaps a district nearby or a school nearby where they could go and see what this looks like. Because I think there is a lot of, it's totally understandable. Change is hard, and it's like, if you don't really understand why it's needed, or you might not want to do it. And I think there are misconceptions about this knowledge building curriculum, that it's going to be boring for kids, that it's going to be too hard for kids. If you can go to a second grade classroom like the one I spent a year following, and you see how excited kids are and how engaged they are and how proud they are of acquiring this knowledge, and that they can definitely do it, then, I've heard from teachers, you come back feeling like, we got to do this.
Right. Absolutely. And you talked about, educators being able to know which district, if they're interested, that they can go to. I think also for parents to, ask the questions of the schools Do you have one of these, knowledge building, content building, rich curriculums? Similarly, as we're talking about having them, do they have an explicit word recognition component, right? Some of them do, some of them don't. You have to partner some of them with word recognition. But again, for both parents and educators to know what questions to ask of their schools so they can be informed as well. And I think the teachers, I mentioned I was trained in whole language, and we're seeing a lot of teachers as they go through professional learning, whether it's letters or something else, and they're having this aha moment. I think it's a similar experience with the knowledge gap of this partner aha of this other piece that they did not get instruction on in their undergrad programs.
Yeah, and I do think, and most of these knowledge building curricula do also cover foundational skills. But I think what's great, and there's certainly one that doesn't, but it's designed to be paired with a foundational skills program. And I think there's this dangerous notion getting out there that to solve our reading problems, we just need to do more phonics. Yep. And 2 hours of phonics. And no, I don't, there's no expert that's recommending that. So if you have a curriculum that guides you to do, say, 20 to 30 minutes of phonics, but the rest of the reading block, kids may be practicing what they've learned, but there's also read alouds and discussion. And, I think it really helps teachers see how you should allocate the time within the reading block and all of the other things that need to be done in addition to that foundational skills instruction. Right.
I think that message of we just need to do more phonics is one of the most disappointing parts of the science of reading movement, that's what people are taking from it. So I so appreciate your time today, Natalie. Thank you so much for this information. We'll make sure to link your podcast and your books and the website that you shared, the knowledgematterscampaign.org, where teachers can go and learn more. They can see the curriculums that align to some of the things we talked about today. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Liz. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. And thanks to our listeners for joining Natalie and me today. There's so much we can learn by engaging in these conversations about what we see happening in education and how we can address it, whether we're a parent or an educator. And I'd love to hear from our listeners. So what conversations are happening in your communities around education? And let us know by joining the conversations on LinkedIn. You'll find our profiles linked in the show notes. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.